Hello everyone. Today we're tackling a fascinating topic about how China transformed itself from one of the poorest countries in the world to an economic powerhouse in just a few decades. This isn't just a story of numbers or growth charts. It's a tale of survival, bold reforms, and yes, a fair bit of controversy. Was it all smooth sailing? Absolutely not. But the way China approached reform is unlike anything we've seen before. In this video, we unpack why reform was not just a smart move, but an absolute necessity for China's survival. We'll also react to some thought-provoking insights from economist Professor Chenggang Xu and some hard-hitting facts. If you're curious about how one country managed to rewrite the rules of economic development, stick around. By the late 1970s, China was one of the poorest nations in the world. Professor Xu mentions that at the start of the reforms, China's per capita GDP was just 1/20th of the US level. A massive nation with a population larger than the US, Europe, and Japan combined was producing less wealth per person than some African countries at the time, and that's despite its sheer size and resources.
At the very beginning of the Chinese economic reform, China was one of the poorest nations. So this is actually a key point. So when the reform started, if we are talking about relative economic development level, China was about something like 1/20th of the US level. So that's significantly below the level of the average Africa per capita GDP. We are talking about such a very, very low level. So it's desperately poor. So starting from this very low level, and then after 30 years, nowadays the Chinese relative development level is close to 1/4 of the US level. So started from 1/20th up to nearly 1/4. So in that sense, it's a huge change. So if we only look at these factors, then yes, this is the biggest event in economic history. And also, when we talk about this growth rate, the key point is that the starting point was very, very low. That's terribly important. So without understanding that, talking about the rise of China can be misleading. So because at the beginning, China was so weak, so poor, so in general, the whole national economy is at a poverty level. So when we talk about this growth achievement in China in the recent 4 decades, we always associate this with the economic reform.
So, why was reform so critical? 2 words: economic disaster. Before reforms, China's system was built on the Soviet-style centrally planned economy. But by 1958, China had already deviated from the Soviet model and created what Xu calls a regionally decentralized totalitarian system. Xu points out something critical. Before these economic reforms, the country was stuck, and the numbers didn't lie. In 1950, just after the People's Republic of China was founded, China's per capita GDP was a mere 5% of the US level. By 1980, it had crawled up to just 6%. 30 years and almost no progress, a whole generation without meaningful change. Why was this the case? Well, 2 major disasters are called out here: the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward, China's attempt at rapid industrialization, led to one of the worst famines in human history. Historians estimate that between 15 to 45 million people died. Then there was the Cultural Revolution, a movement aimed at purging capitalist and traditional elements from society. An ambitious project, but with disastrous results. It destabilized the economy, disrupted education, and plunged the country into political chaos. Entire communities were torn apart. By the time it ended in 1976, the Chinese economy was barely standing. So, reform wasn't just an option for China at that point. It was a matter of survival. As Xu points out, China didn't copy the Western model or fully abandon control. Instead, they created the regionally decentralized totalitarian system.
Reform means no great leap forward movement, no cultural revolution, and the whole way of organizing the economy has to be changed. So there is a sort of a misleading explanation about China, saying that China was a centrally planned economy and then changing to a market economy. This is not quite accurate. The so-called centrally planned economy, usually by describing in this way, implies the Soviet model. China, since 1950, when China established this People's Republic of China, established this system, they fully implemented or copied the Soviet model. But since 1958, China has changed the institution. So it's no longer a Soviet type of centrally planned economy anymore. So the institution has been changed, the centrally planned being abandoned. So it becomes a administratively planned but not centrally planned economy. So I characterize that kind of system as a regionally decentralized totalitarian system, because in the political economy, the Soviet system is described as a totalitarian system. China changed that a little bit in terms of administration. So although the whole economy, the overall society is governed in a totalitarian way, but in terms of administration, in terms of resource allocation, is regionally decentralized in the sense that the local governments control substantial amount of resources and they manage their local economies. So based upon this institution, so there are two waves of changing from the Soviet system into this kind of a Chinese type of administratively planned economy. So based upon this kind of institution, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the economic reform started. Then in the earlier decades of the economic reforms, the major strategy is regional competition. So this so-called regional competition is qualitatively different from market competition. Here, the competition is not in the sense of profit maximization. It's not in the sense of competition in the market. Instead, these are a sort of a tournament competition that the local governments are ranked. So they compete for ranking. They compete to become number one. So for example, within a city, you have several, about 10 counties, and the counties within the city, they wanted to become number one. They compete for the number one position. And within a province, you are going to have roughly about 10 cities. And each city they are competing each other. They want to be the number one in the province. And in the whole nation, you have a little bit more than 30 provincial level regions. They compete each other as well. And here the key issue is what are the targets of the competition? So at earlier stages of the economic reform, the competition target is GDP growth rate. And turns out this is a very effective approach in terms of promoting the economic reform and the growth. So this is how the reform is associated with growth, or growth is associated with reform. Because in order to grow, the regional governments have to find their way. So to grow, actually is a big challenge. How to grow? This is a big challenge. So at the very beginning of the reform, there were lots of emphasis on the reform of the state sectors. But turns out that is not working well. That didn't work well.
The reforms started small. They didn't start in the cities or big industries. No, the first breakthrough came in the countryside. Farmers were given more control over their land through partial privatization. This tiny tweak sparked what some call China's rural industrial revolution. This was a game changer. Farmers who once had no incentive to work hard suddenly saw personal benefits. Productivity soared. Within a few years, township and village enterprises, these small community-based industries, became the backbone of the economy. By the mid-1980s, they were driving most of China's growth. It's like China found its economic heartbeat in the countryside, not the skyscrapers of Beijing or Shanghai.
And the first successful reform was in agriculture. Actually, it involves the land reform. It's a partial privatization. Partial means there is no fundamental change in ownership, but the using rights have been privatized. So with using rights and also the exchange of using rights, these are privatized. So based upon that, there is a sort of industrial revolution in the sense of the rural industrial development. So at the very early stage of the economic reform, most of the growth actually occurred in this area, the so-called township village enterprises. Starting from a very low base up to the mid-1990s, the largest sector is this sector in the whole Chinese economy. And that actually is also the base for the private sector when the private sector became partially legalized in the 1990s. So then in the whole 1990s and early 21st century, China had a very rapid growth of the private sector. From zero to nowadays, it's more than half of the GDP being produced by the private sector. So if we look at the Chinese constitution, both the state constitution and the party's constitution, then we find that by constitutions, party constitution and the state constitution, private sector was not allowed until 2002, the change of party's constitution, and 2004, the change of the state constitution. So until the early 21st century, private sector was not legal. However, up to that point, the private sector was already half of the GDP. So if we are talking about the so-called China miracle, what is the miracle? This is the miracle.